With tensions growing between the Soviet Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in the 1950s, Allied commanders were desperate to find a way to counter the Soviets, who seemingly outmatched NATO in conventional military power along the Iron Curtain. For a short time, the US believed it was prepared to defend Europe with the placement of nuclear-armed B-29s in England. But when the Soviets detonated their own atomic bomb in 1949, the calculus changed dramatically. NATO needed more firepower, and it needed it fast. In 1950, Secretary of the Army Gordon Gray came out swinging and argued for, quote, a fundamental and immediate change in emphasis based on the realization that strategic bombing will not hold Western Europe or defeat Russia. The US aimed to push the battle lines forward and prepared for an aggressive counteroffensive to strike the Soviets in Eastern Europe should the Soviets make any moves towards the West. The deployment of tactical nukes was suddenly on the table. The only question was how to deliver the weapons. The F-84 fighter jet was initially chosen for this task, but it would soon be replaced with something even faster. North American's F-100 Super Sabre, the first US fighter capable of supersonic speeds. They would be placed on quick reaction alert, or as the pilots and crew called it, Victor alert. In the event that their mission was activated, it would be a one-way trip. A nuke to win the war. A decade into the Cold War, the Russians had almost 200 active Soviet divisions and 125 reserves ready to deploy within a month. NATO was outnumbered. A ground invasion would likely mean defeat for the European Allied armies unless they had the serious backing of US military power. When President Eisenhower took office in 1953, he realized that any effective counterattack strategy without the massive buildup of military personnel in Europe needed to involve nuclear bombs. These could be targeted at the Soviet forces on the front and at the supporting infrastructure behind their lines. In this area, the US and its allies had the upper hand. America already had a large arsenal of atomic bombs, while the Soviets did not. These could serve as a practical war deterrent. In the worst possible scenario, the cash could also help fight and win a Third World War. The North Atlantic Council had previously accepted a strategy like this in 1950 and had agreed that tactical nuclear weapons were essential in the Cold War. Eisenhower's plan was specific. He wanted 50 divisions and plenty of fighter jets armed with nuclear weapons. These would be flown in missions over the Fulda Gap, a bottleneck geographical highway that Soviet armored formations would use to pour into Western Germany. With these missions, the US would make a show of force to ensure that the Russians knew NATO had plenty of nuclear weapons armed on quick-striking fighters. Their first objective wasn't to attack, as long as the Soviets behaved. These flights were merely practice, however, for a plan named Quick Reaction Alert. To USAF pilots and their crews, this potentially deadly operation was known as Victor Alert. In Victor Alert, the American pilots, and later other Allied pilots, would be trained for a one-way-only nuclear strike against the massive Soviet forces. While some NATO-friendly bases were close to the Fulda Gap, pilots had to be aware that a return trip would most likely be impossible. In all likelihood, there wouldn't be enough fuel for the fighters to make it back to friendly airspace. The Hun. The most utilized plane for the Victor Alert protocol was the F-100 Super Sabre. Also known as the Hun, or the Dancer, it was the first fighter jet capable of supersonic speeds. The aircraft began replacing other fighter bombers as soon as it came into production. It was larger, faster, and with a more extended range. The plane was delivered to several fighter wings all over the world, predominantly in Europe. England, West Germany, Spain, Italy, Turkey, and the Netherlands were all eager to dance with the F-100. The Hun was chosen to take part in the Victor Alert to carry the new Mark 7 nuclear bomb on its left intermediate pylon station. The F-100 variant could bear a 200-gallon fuel tank on the left wing and a 275-gallon one on the right side. Still, its combat radius was very limited. Their targets were bridges, airfields, railroad yards, and radar sites. Any critical area that would hinder the Soviets. If these marks were closer than 520 miles from their home base, a round trip was feasible. But these could be kamikaze missions for the pilots. Most of the targets were more than 1,000 miles away, so the men were aware that an active Victor Alert would most likely be their last flight. Labs. Although the bomb delivery methods evolved over time, the primary technique the Hun used was the low-altitude bombing system, also known as labs, or toss bombing. In this maneuver, the pilot would drop empty fuel tanks and descend to only 50 feet above ground level. After this, he would race towards the target at 575 miles per hour with the engine's afterburner turned on. He would then pull up into a half loop and release the bomb from a vertical orientation. The weapon would arc up before swiftly falling towards the target. The pilot then had only 54 seconds to clear out of the nuclear blast as fast as possible. Risking blindness from the flash, most of them used eye patches in one eye. If the pilot survived the maneuver, he then faced another struggle. The airplane would be low on fuel. The odds that their home base was already destroyed were high. They would look for other Allied pilots or fly as fast as they could to Sweden or Finland, who were neutral. If they didn't reach safe territory on time, they ran a significant risk of being captured by the Russians or taken out in the air. Training for a nuclear attack. The training period for Victor Alert was filled with accidents. The F-100 was known to be tricky to fly, especially when configured for nuclear bombs. Most of the pilots and crews trained for the mission were recent graduates with only 300 flight hours. During training, the crews were first instructed on how the Mark 7 bomb was constructed, armed, and detonated. In Europe, they also practiced the low-level maneuver used to drop the weapon on mock routes. But flying in the poor and unpredictable European weather also led to plenty of accidents. In only the last 6 months of 1959, a dozen F-100s were lost in West Germany. Waiting every night. Although Victor Alert was implemented every night, it was, after all, a preventative protocol, and the pilots treated it as such. At Ramstein Air Base, the pilots would usually arrive for their assignment after happy hour. They didn't think Victor Alert would ever actually be implemented. At midnight, the men would drive up to their aircraft, start the engine, install the core part of the Mark 7 bomb, and make sure the green light indicator was turned on. They would wait a few minutes and then reverse the entire procedure. They would then shut down the F-100's engine, drive back to their trailers, and go to sleep. Changing the game. In late 1959, these lax nuclear procedures changed when it was realized that any drunk pilot could start the F-100's engine, take off, and begin World War III on their own. When the rules changed, Victor Alert now required 2 people. It also had heavier security, in which pictures were taken of the pilot and his crew to make sure they were allies. The only person allowed in the aircraft's cockpit was the pilot, who was also the only one with a secret password. Commander of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers in Europe, General Norstad, personally visited Ramstein to verify the correct implementation of these more rigorous security procedures. The F-100 service in Europe was relatively brief and began being replaced by newer aircraft. Even the Mark 7 was obsolete compared to the newer Mark 28 and Mark 43. Victor Alert wasn't the only way of delivering nuclear weapons. In the 1970s, NATO had already tested various other methods, such as the Nike Hercules air defense missile, the Honest John surface-to-surface missile, and anti-submarine warfare weapons, as well as nuclear landmines and aircraft gravity bombs. But Victor Alert definitely worked. In the 70s, Soviet lobbyists expressed great interest in limiting nuclear-capable tactical aircraft. Nuclear strategies today. Tactical nuclear weapons for top-tier fighters are still sources of military strength, even in the 21st century NATO strategies. But today, USAF pilots in Europe don't perform Victor Alert on F-100s. However, other aircraft, such as F-16s and F-15Es, can move back to an alert position and quickly arm up with nuclear weapons if necessary. The Air Force's nuclear bombs delivery strategies through fighter jets have never entirely gone away in Europe. Instead, it rises and falls depending on the tension or increasing threat. An updated version of the B-61 bomb is under development, and when ready, it will be carried on the F-35A Lightning II. These kinds of nuclear weapon strategies and roles change over time, but they will always exist. As Hillary Clinton said in April 2010, quote, "We should recognize that as long as nuclear weapons exist, NATO will remain a nuclear alliance."